Adverbs. In this chapter, we are studying about adverbs. An adverb is a word that changes or simplifies the meaning of a verb, adjective, other adverbs, clause, or sentence. First, fairly or rather. Fairly is used with favorable adjectives and adverbs, while rather is used before unfavorable adjectives and adverbs. For example, Ram is fairly clever, but Ramesh is rather foolish. Ram walks fairly fast, but Anil walks rather slowly. Rather, when used before a like, similar, different, etc., and before comparatives, means a little or slightly. For example, these cats are rather like cubs in some ways. The weather was rather hot than we had expected. Second, hardly, scarcely, or barely. These adverbs are almost negative in meaning. Hardly is usually used with any, ever, at all, or the verb can. For example, she has hardly any money, which means very little money. We hardly ever go out, which means we seldom go out. One should not be confused with the verbs hard and hardly. For example, he worked hard on it, which means that he worked hard. She hardly looked at me, which means that she seldom looks at me. Scarcely means almost not and can replace hardly as used above. But scarcely is usually used to mean not quite. For example, there were scarcely 10 people in the meeting, or probably fewer. Barely means not more than, or only just. For example, his voice was barely audible. There were barely 10 people in the meeting. Third, yet or still. Both are adverbs of time. Yet means up to the time of speaking. It is usually used with the negative or interrogative. Still emphasizes that the action continues. It is mainly used with the affirmative or interrogative. It can also be used with the negative to emphasize the continuance of an action. For example, he hasn't completed yet. He hasn't applied yet for the license I told him about. He is still in bed. Has she come? Not yet. The jeep hasn't arrived yet. Yet is normally placed after the verb or after the verb followed by the object. If the object consists of a large number of words, yet can be replaced before the verb as well. For example, still is placed after the word be but before other verbs. Fourth, since or ever since. Since and ever since are used with perfect tenses. Since can be placed after the auxiliary or in the end position after a negative or interrogative verb. Ever since, adverb, is usually placed in the end position. Phrases and clauses with since and ever since are usually in the end position, though front position is also possible. For example, I first met her 3 years ago and have remembered her face ever since. He's been in bed since his accident. Fifth, somehow or anyhow. Somehow means in some way or the other and can be placed in the front position or after a verb without object or after object. For example, somehow they managed. I wasn't qualified to apply for this job, but I got it anyhow. Anyhow is an adverb of manner. It is often used to mean in any case or any way. Sixth, to. To is different from very. To means excess, more than enough or more than necessary. For example, he is too weak to walk. We can use an infinitive structure after to followed by an adjective, adverb or determiner. She is too old to work. If the infinitive has its own subject, this is introduced by for. It's too late for the shops to be opened. The subject of a sentence with to can also be the object of the following infinitive. Object pronouns are not normally used after the infinitive in such cases. The water is too hot to drink, for example. However, object pronouns are possible in these structures with for. For example, the water is too hot for us to drink. To is normally not used before an adjective followed by a noun. For example, I put down the bag because it was too heavy would be correct. I put down the too heavy bag is an incorrect construction. In a rather formal style, to can also be used before adjective followed by a or an followed by a noun. For example, it's too cold a day to go out. He was too clever a businessman to accept the offer initially. Seventh, too or too much. Before adjectives with nouns and before adverbs, we use too but not too much. For example, you're too kind to me would be correct. You're too much kind to me is an incorrect construction. I arrived too early. I arrived too much early would be an incorrect construction. Eighth, much or very. Generally, participles are modified by much and adjectives by very. Certain principles which have largely lost their verbal force and are felt to be adjectival, however, take very. For example, the law has been much abused. Her dress was much admired. It is a very good book. This is a very old building. She is a clever girl. Conversely, participles used before a noun to make a compound adjective with a modifying adverb. For example, a much abused privilege, a much travelled person, a much discussed question. Ninth, seldom. Seldom is an adverb. We may say, I seldom go to London, but not my visits to London are seldom. For here, we are treating the word as a predicative adjective. It can be used after a verb in this way, and then as an adverb only in the following types of construction. After it is, and followed by a that clause in opposition to the anticipatory pronoun it. For example, it is seldom that we get such an opportunity as this. In a relative clause that refers back to the whole notion expressed in a preceding clause of time. For example, when she lost her temper, which was seldom. Whenever I take a day off from work, which is seldom, and so on. In a parenthetic clause referring back to the entire notion expressed in a preceding adverb clause of time. For example, whenever I take a day off from work, which is seldom. Tenth, enough. Adjective or adverb followed by enough. When enough modifies an adjective or adverb, it normally comes after the adjective or the adverb. For example, is that music loud enough? These shoes are not big enough. You're not driving fast enough. We haven't got a big enough house. A position with adjective followed by a noun, enough follows an adjective which it modifies. But when enough modifies an adjective and noun together, it comes before the adjective. Compare. We haven't got big enough nails, which means that we need bigger nails. So here enough modifies big. Enough followed by an infinitive. The adverb enough is often followed by an infinitive. For example, she didn't run fast enough to win. She is old enough to do what she wants. Infinitives can be introduced by for, followed by the noun or the pronoun. Object forms of pronouns are used. For example, it's late enough for the staff to stop work. There was just enough light for us to see what we were doing.